This is a University of Otago podcast.
Okay, so now we have Thom Elston. Unfortunately, Dave Bilkley isn't going to be here, and he's going to be talking about how to influence behaviour, and it's an introduction to operant theory. So, over to you.
Hey, everybody. Nice to see such a packed room. So my talk today is effectively going to be about a toolbox that I use quite often. I'm an animal scientist, so I do lots of the implanting stuff in brains of rodents and teaching them how to do different things and correlating their brain and behavior. But brain data is only as interesting as behavioral data. I mean, you can study as much as you want about some abstract phenomenon, but until you can relate it to what someone actually does, it doesn't really become interesting, in my view. So what I want to share today is just a little bit about the toolbox of both how I consider designing behavioral experiments, which are later related to brain data, but also about how it is that this same toolbox can be applied to the human domain. So the first thing I kind of want to highlight is that people are weird. People do strange things. This guy in particular strikes me as strange. I can't imagine a smarter person. So why do people do what they do? And I think one of the fundamental assumptions we have to make is that there is some kind of biological machinery which describes the mind-brain dynamic, that mind grows out of brain, and that the brain is effectively a very elegant mechanism. So things which are mechanistic operate according to principles and reasons. And so one of the fundamental assumptions that we're going to make going forward is that there's no kind of voluntary conscious behavior which occurs without some kind of goal. And kind of to that, on the one hand, there are folks who are, like the person who glued spoons to himself. There's also this idea of human excellence. And this is kind of one of my favorite inspirational quotes from my boy Aristotle. And it's effectively saying that we are what we repeatedly do. And he has this old proverb talking about a cowardly man and a brave man. And the main idea is that someone who's a coward is only a coward because they do cowardly things. But if the cowardly man begins doing brave things, the character of his quality changes from cowardly to brave. And so all I really want to say with this is that we are what we do, and our identity is kind of like the Wittgensteinian description of language. The meaning of a word is defined by how it's used, so the meaning of a person is defined by their behavioral function. So there are two types of behavior, voluntary behavior and involuntary unconscious behavior. And today we're going to focus on voluntary behavior. So things that mean you are consciously choosing to do it. Free will is involved, or something we think is free will. This is not the same behavior as touching a hot stove and crying out in pain or being in a cloud of dust. This is more like choosing to come here, or the first time someone decides to do heroin or something like that. There's a choice at first, and then maybe later on in addiction, it became no choice. So operant theory is effectively the study of voluntary behavior and the mechanisms of it. And so there's a fun little thing called what I call the ABC rule, antecedent behavior consequence. So the idea is that first you notice something, then you do something, and then you get something. And the big punchline idea with operant theory is that it's the consequences of your actions which determine the likelihood of future behavior. So in this example, what you desire from this child in the picture is the child to be polite. So one of the things that you can do there is that you can conscientiously reward the child for being polite. And the idea is that if, as a result, as a consequence of the child emitting that kind of desired behavior, you give the child what it wants, the frequency of that desired behavior will increase. right? So to put it in maybe more plain terms, with my rats, they're trained to run laps in a maze and play matching games with touchscreens. And you might imagine a rat doesn't actually naturally do this, right? Touchscreens aren't part of their natural world. But they're totally happy to do it as long as I give them Cocoa Pops. So they notice something, they notice a pattern on the screens, they do something, they match the pattern, and then they get something when they get Cocoa Pops. And if they don't do it right, they don't get anything. And that the non-presentation of a reward can be the same thing as a punishment. So the big idea that I want to say here is that the fundamental notions of operant theory are notice something, do something, get something, in that all behavior, all voluntary behavior, is driven by the expected consequence of an action that we take. And the interesting thing about this is that the same idea has incredible parallels in the biology of the brain in terms of something called the Hebbian postulate, which describes how it is that neurons fire and wire together. So consider the rat pressing the touchscreens. Maybe the rat has a group of neurons that represent the touchscreens and another group of neurons that represent the Cocoa Pops at the end. Cells that fire together, wire together. Those two groups of cells will connect. And when those two groups of cells actually connect, whenever the rat sees the touchscreens, the association with the reward is also activated, right? So you could kind of say that the cue becomes associated with the consequence. The thing you notice becomes associated with the thing that you get. And because you want the thing that you hopefully will get, you will emit or you will behave in such a goal-directed way as to get that thing. And we can use this. And this is kind of the basis of all, I would say, kind of advanced behavioral techniques. And so kind of the last big thing I want to talk about is what these methods really are. And in my view, this is kind of like the cheat codes of human behavior and animal behavior. And it's fascinating that with all of these different things, there are very precise brain mechanisms that are known to be associated with these. So you'll see it's kind of a four-square table. So positive means like you're adding something to the situation. So a positive reinforcement, that's like a positive reward. That's like my rat getting a Cocoa Pop. I'm positively adding something to the situation as a consequence for his behavior. Now, positive punishment is saying I'm going to positively add something bad. So maybe, I don't know, if the rat presses the wrong pattern, I'm going to play a really high-pitched screech, which I don't, but if I did, the rat wouldn't like it, and that would be like adding something bad as a consequence, right? But there's also negative, and this is, I think, one of the kind of more subtle, interesting things. Sometimes a good outcome isn't always getting something good. Sometimes a good outcome is the removal of something bad. So I don't know if you've ever had a coworker or something like that that just talks and talks and talks and you can't stand them. And sometimes you're just waiting for any kind of situation to just get away, get out of that situation. And then that thing comes. Maybe it's a person or a phone call or something, and you really appreciate that thing. And you don't appreciate that thing because it gave you something, but you appreciate it because it took away something bad, right? And there are all sorts of interesting circumstances to where the removal of something aversive is itself a reward. Now, the final other aspect of this is negative punishment. So this is kind of like timeout. And timeout is surprisingly effective for both humans and non-humans to remove the opportunity for them to get what they want, right? Or just to remove something good. That's negative punishment. And I guess the interesting thing here is that, you could really spend a whole year just talking about the relationship between these ideas of reinforcement and punishment and the positive and negative aspects. But I think just kind of as an application of this, I want to show y'all, is it possible to to click on this and to pull it up. So how do I do that? If I click on it, it's just going to go to the next slide. What I really want to do is just paste that link into a browser. Well, if that doesn't work, I can just talk about it. So the main idea is that this group of people, and I guess some of you will probably have seen this, they ask the question, what if we use the idea of positive reinforcement, adding something good to a situation to change public behavior? And the behavior they want to change is, can we get more people to take the stairs than to take the escalator? So in this case, most people would say that novelty, non-aversive novelty, is good, right? So in that case, maybe if I take some sensors, touch sensors, I put them into the floor and make a staircase like a piano such that every step is like a different note of the piano. It just sounds like someone's walking up a scale as they're walking up the stairs. So the question is, can this kind of carrot of non-aversive novelty, can this possible addition of reinforcement to the behavior of walking up the stairs change the amount of people who will take the stairs versus who will take the escalator? And the results were reasonably shocking. I want to say it was like, they give the right percentage in the video, but I'm going to ballpark it and say 60%. More than half of the people who would normally take the escalator shifted their behavior to walk on the stairs. And there are lots of other interesting examples of this, because you can use this idea to shape mass social behavior. So like, effectively, how can you herd the mob in such a way to make their behavior more desirable? You can use this to shape your own behavior and say, these same principles apply to the creation and the destruction of behavior, and it also applies to animals. And I guess kind of the final take-home thing, I didn't make a slide for it because I didn't think I'd get this far, is that these same rules also describe mental behavior. So the words we use, the preferences that we seem to have can also be described by the patterns and relationships between reinforcement and punishment in both a positive and negative sense. So what I am trying to drive home is that you should all go and Google this later, operant theory, and I hope that you will view these as kind of cheat codes to decoding and applying behavioral principles to your own life and to your interactions with others. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
You paste it into the browser so we can see them.
I'm going to try.
While we're doing that, we'll see if we can...
Okay. How do I get out of here? Go to the browser. Okay. Paste and go.
Cool. That was really interesting. I have a small question. Just towards the sort of in the middle there, you alluded you put a caveat across free will. And I was just curious if you're a compatibilist or a determinist, or you think it's determinism, but all humans are frustrators. What's your how's your feel?
Free will versus determinism in 10 seconds.
The 1 minute summary.
The 1 minute summary. I'm going to say I'm going to go with a meta answer. I'm going to say that let me phrase it this way. You can't control what you do in the present. Everything that we do in an instant of time is stimulus response, right? But let's say over time you find that there's certain things you like versus things that you don't like. So, and maybe you learn that there are things associated with things that you like and don't like, right? So in the future, maybe you will seek out stimuli which will cause a response which is desirable to you, right? So in that way, the things that you do in the future with regard to the types of things that you seek out to elicit a desired response is something close to free will. I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily 100% either way, but I think if free will does exist, it exists kind of like it exists in the equivalent of how acceleration can describe the change of speed over time. So I think it's some kind of like meta phenomenon that if it does exist, it's not something that we can consciously interact with.
Okay, cool. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.